There's another thing to consider. If the state can charter a corporation, if the state can create corporate privilege and then turn around and tax it, we have to ask a question. Can the state create a corporation which holds lands and then come and tax those lands? If the state could do that, it could certainly offer enough benefits and privileges to corporate business that through this increased benefit to certain businesses, you would soon find all business to be incorporated. You would find every businessman wanting to incorporate to get these extra benefits offered by the state. And if his property were drawn in under this corporate charter, then we would have the state as landlord, sooner or later, over all property, all land. This would be soon be seen to squeeze out the private property owner completely, because as a productionist, he couldn't compete with the corporations. He couldn't farm his land and get the same benefits in the marketplace as the corporation, and soon he would be squeezed out. He couldn't exist anymore. Then we would have the state erected as the landlord by and through corporations over all property. I think this is pretty close to what we have as a situation today. This is a fraudulent system. I think that the property tax will be found to be unconstitutional completely. That there is no such thing as a tax on land by the state. For one thing, individuals own land. Corporations do not. Corporations cannot own land, because to own land, one must possess land. There are two things go into making a legal title: the right to possession and the actual possession. A man must have the right to possession before he can possess, but he must have the right to possession to retain possession. He either must possess it himself or have an agent possess it. The corporation, then, not being a man, cannot take possession because it's only a legal fiction. It has no possessory powers. One must be a material thing in order to possess a material thing. Okay, we're going to shift over here and get Bob Hallstrom in here with some good quotes out of a Bouvier's dictionary. And he's done a lot of research on this property issue, and we're just going to go to some terms and definitions and have him take it away.
Thank you, Nelis. Well, we think it's important that we understand the words that we use, and our study of law has told us if you don't understand the words, then you can't understand the law. So Nelis has been telling you about this right of possession. So I'm going to read you what Bouvier has to say about right of possession. Right of possession: the right to possess which may reside in one man, while another man has the actual possession, being the right to enter and turn out such lawful occupant. Now, what do we have there? We have that tenant relationship again. We've got the slave-master, your feudal system. You have one person who owns that piece of land, who has the actual right of entry, who has another man residing on it. One man actually is in possession, that he has physically got his feet on the ground, but he doesn't own it. He doesn't have the actual right of possession. It's the man who owns it. He who has the property title to it, who has the actual right of possession. And that's the man that's going to kick the other guy off. And that's what our state is doing to us today. Our state government is telling us, or our county government, that they own the land. Now, they're not coming out admitting that, but in practice, this is how it works with your state tax issue on property. If you don't pay that property tax, they're going to come in and take it away from you and sell it to some good slave who will pay the property tax. So who then has the actual right of possession? That being the person who can kick the other one off. So your state is claiming your land, and they're going to take it away from you when you don't perform. Isn't that about how that works, Felix?
Yeah.
Let's get on then with property. We've got a lot of definitions of property, and we're going to stay on this word since that's where our class is today. So I'm going to give you just a couple quotes, and I'm going to ask Nelis to expound on this a little bit. Property is the sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in total exclusion to the right of any other individual in the universe. That means the right to possess, the right to use, the right to enjoy, and the right to dispose of a thing. And a person must have that free use and enjoyment by a person of all acquisitions without any control or any dominion of any other person, or it just can't be property. For example, A right of action is property. A right of action. A right of action in the courtroom. That's a right of action. When you go into the courtroom and you want to sue somebody, you're exercising your right to a specific action. Somebody's damaged you. You want to get your property back, or you want some type of remuneration for it. You've got to go in the courtroom to do it. So you have that right of action, and that is a property right. And that's property. Property, then, in the strict legal sense, is an aggregate of rights which are guaranteed and protected by government. Guaranteed and protected by government. That is the sole purpose of our government, are to protect and guarantee our rights. They're supposed to acknowledge them and protect them. And all property, then, is a word that encompasses something larger than just a small word. I guess that doesn't sound right, but it's an aggregate, as I said in the definition. In other words, all rights are really property. It's not a small word that just means land. Property is not land. It's a bigger class of word that has an enormous meaning. For example, your ability to use money is a right that you have, but it's a property. It's a property that you have. A chosen action, you've probably heard us use that term. That's your Federal Reserve note or any other type of paper fiction that you want to use for money. You can use that if you want to, and that's your right to do so. And that's a property right that you have. It's not a money right, but it's a property right. Another right that we look at from the form of property is a man and wife's relationship. Do you know that you have rights between each other? And that's property. Bouvier says this: the reciprocal rights of the wife to the society, protection, support of her husband, and his right to her society and service in his household may be regarded as the property of the respective parties. So you've got property rights right in your marriage, and that's a property, of course, which we can refer to basically as rights. You also have common law action. You can still go into some courts, or you should be able to, and have a common law action in those courts, and that would be another type of right that you'd have, or any right to recover damages from anything. The right to labor. Do we have the right to work? Well, certainly we do. Do we need a right to work bill? Absolutely not. Every person has the right to work and the right to labor, and that's a property right, and you can't take it away from me. Of course, we have government trying to restrict this property right, and that creates a lot of problems for us, and they try to tax our capacity to work, and that creates more problems. But you do have the right to labor. You have the right to go out and cut wood, dig ditches, or to be a lawyer, or anything else you want to do, and that is property.
That reminds me of a quote I looked up here. It's Frederick Bastiat in The Law. Life, faculties, production, in other words, individuality, liberty, property. This is man. And in spite of cunning of artful political leaders, these three gifts from God precede all human legislation, are superior to it. Life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. So a man's property, being his labor, is something that no human legislation can touch upon, because it was for that very reason that our governments were founded in the first place. And to make legislation that would take any part of that property away from a person, being the things that he produces and the fruits of his labor, this would be to overturn the very existing principles of government. Bastiat was a very good author in the 19th century who wrote down a lot of the very fundamental principles. And in another quote to go along the same line, I maintain, therefore, that the security of the citizen against such arbitrary legislation rests upon the more broader and solid ground of natural rights, and is not wholly dependent upon those negatives upon legislation formally contained in the Constitution. It can never be admitted as a just attribute of sovereignty in a government to take the property of one citizen and bestow it upon another. The exercise of such power is incompatible with the nature and object of all government, and is destructive of the great end and aim for which government is instituted, and is subservice of the fundamental principles upon which all free governments operate.
Well, Neelis, would you say then the right to labor or property is probably the most basic right of our entire society?
Absolutely. It must be so, because to take away anything that a man owns would be to make him your servant, would be to exercise a superior right to his, and he would no longer be a sovereign citizen at that point in time. Then
what you're saying is then rights precede government.
Yes. Yes, all governments are founded upon the principle that the rights of the human being were the very reason for instituting government. Our Declaration of Independence lays that out in perfect clear terms. Yeah. Probably the best statement of that sort that's ever been written by man.
And we have two classes of property, too. We also have corporal and incorporeal property. If we're talking about corporal property, we're talking about that which is the senses such as lands, houses, goods, and merchandise.
Yeah.
Okay, and
tangible.
Tangible type items, okay. And the latter, then, would be things like our chosen actions or our other type rights, which we think more easements, things that are not tangible, I guess. That would be the definition between the two?
Yeah, the chosen action would be one. It's a right that you have. You must take action in a court to get the recovery of that right. And other things are intangible, such as a right of way or a water right. You have a right to go across somebody's land to get to your property if his land surrounds yours. That would be an intangible right that affixes to property. Maybe a few more of those.
Okay. Let's talk about absolute property then, and see if we have any of this stuff left today with our government involvement. The right of using a thing indefinitely is an essential quality of absolute property, without which absolute property can have no legal existence. Use is the real side of property. This right of user necessarily includes the right and power of excluding others from the land. Do you think we function that way in our society today?
No, not in the slightest, because today a man has to not only pay the property tax on his land, but he has to abide by all the rules and regulations which your legislature and which certain other administrative bodies have placed on the property. You can't build without getting first a permit. You have to pay money for that. You can't build without then following the codes that they've laid down for you. You have to build according to some other man's standards that were laid down by a supposed administrative body with power over your land. You must follow all the rules of the book in putting in sewers. You don't even have a choice on what kind of facilities you're going to have quite often. An electrical permit must be given. You must have all of the codes specified and carried out completely in your building. So there's a little quote that I read in the book of Ecclesiasticus that comes in here. It's basically, I think it's completely applicable today, that it says, "He who builds his house at other men's charges is like unto he who gathers stones to build in the winter." And anybody knows if you're going to build with mortar in the winter and it freezes, it's just going to fall apart. Come spring, it's not even going to make it. So if you build your house at other men's charges, you're basically a fool. And here we are. We're having other men tell us how to build, how to do anything that we do with our land. And if we don't, I guess we get taken to court or shut down completely or fined or whatever. And this kind of property that we're reading of here in a dictionary that's not even 80 years old yet, it's not existent today.
That's interesting. We can say then that absolute property is that which is our own without any qualification whatsoever, as when a man owns a simple thing like a watch on his wrist, or a ring on his hand, or a book, or anything like that would be an absolute ownership of property, to include our land, or our car. Those are all tangible items and things that we all own some of. But when our government interferes then and makes you license them or tries to regulate the use of them, it's no longer absolute property because there's a condition involved there with the ownership of the property. You must perform or you can't own and use that property. Wouldn't you say that's about the way that works?
Yeah, why don't you read some more of those quotes and we'll kind of run through some more of those.
Okay, so that property considered then as an exclusive right to things, the right to possess something or the right of ownership, contains not only the right to use those things, but a right to dispose of them, either by exchanging them for other things or by giving them away to any other person without any consideration or even throwing them away. Well, you can't get rid of an automobile these days that way. You can't transfer it from one person to the other. You cannot do that. You can't even get married without the third party being involved in the contract, and that being the state. If you want to transfer title or ownership to anything, you've got to go register it. It takes 3 people to make a contract anymore. 2 people just can't do it. There's states constantly involved in everything that you do. So therefore, you really don't have any absolute rights of property anymore.
Not only that, another application is in the personal property tax. If you have, for example, farm equipment, and you want to dispose or sell a piece of it, or say you want to just give it to somebody, if you don't tell your county assessor who now owns the property, he'll fine you basically the same amount as he was taxing you before and start tacking on interest. And he'll tax you for that thing even though you no longer own it. So you don't even have a right of privacy in your dealings, and you certainly don't have the right to simply dispose of property without divulging that transaction to the state. And there again, we see the right of privacy as being part of the right of property. And I think it will be seen that the right of property is the fundamental right of all free men, and everything else kind of flows out from that right.
Well, let's talk about that word right just a moment, because rights then are subservient to property, or a type of property. And there's 2 basic types of rights. You've got inalienable rights and you've got legal rights. And your inalienable rights are those rights that come to you from the Creator, or from the Master, or from God. And your legal rights is a claim found or grounded in the law of the land. And our law of the land being, of course, the Constitution. And that's our way of life. That's established the ground rules of how we were going to perform in this society. Not what our legislature does, but what we do and what we determined was going to be right and wrong. And we did that with our Constitution. The principles of life, liberty, and property. Now, rights can only inhere in and exist between mortal beings. Now, Nelis and I here have rights and duties and obligations between us. But when you take the third party out here and set government up here somewhere and say government is in this contract now, where is the legal rights at that point? Governments have no rights. And don't let them tell you that they've got the right of entry or the right of this and the right of arrest. They don't have rights. They have certain limited powers, and we have granted them those powers through our constitutional documents. But they do not, and I repeat, they do not have rights. They can only exist in between mortal men. I'll read that to you. Rights can only adhere in and exist between mortal beings, and no mortal being can coexist without rights.
Well, we granted our government certain powers. We didn't grant it personhood, so to speak. We didn't make it a citizen. We granted it certain powers to carry out the job that we intended it to do. And as such, some of the legal lingo in the courts will go that the government has a right or an interest to do a certain thing. Well, this is always in the context of what it has been granted. If the government has not been granted a right to do something, then it can't do it. It can't claim that as an interest of the government. It can't administer it as an interest of the government. So the term right is loosely used, but in its strict legal sense, only men have rights, and only those free men have rights that have founded that government to protect those rights. And that's the specific purpose of government.
Let's go back just a minute then and get into the basics of our government. I'm going to use my hand to illustrate, and I don't know if I've done this before, but rights precede government or the establishment of any state. It's always been that way with any civilization that's ever existed. Man came along first, and of course if we start at the top of this totem pole, we're going to say that God was here first, and He created all things. But below that became man. And man existed and had certain problems within any society that he had. And so in order to function and to establish a system of control over these rights and duties that he had between himself and other parties, he created a government of some sort. In the United States, we created a constitution, which was a little different, unique from any other country. That constitution granted certain limited powers to government, or created the government. Then the government creates the bureaucrats, because they have to have somebody to turn the wheels and nuts and bolts of the government. See? So there we have it. We had God, and we had man running around the earth. Man created the Constitution. The Constitution granted powers to a government, and the government, of course, had to be run by bureaucrats. Now, that was the orderly system of things in this country. Now, what we really have now in this country is a total flip-flop. What you've got now is man down here. God is just out of the picture entirely. Man is the slave on the bottom of the list. And where is everything else? It's just gone by the wayside. And what do we really have? We have all these bureaucrats up here in total control and dominion over our property and of our rights. And if they don't give it to us, then we don't have it. And that's not the way our government was organized. All rights precede government. All rights were acknowledged before government ever came along. And the government was only established to protect those rights that we demanded in our documents. So we created and granted to ourselves what rights we wanted. And we enumerated them many, many times in the Constitution with 3 simple words: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A legal right, then, is a constitutional right. And it's a right protected by law. And that's all the law is there to do, is to protect our rights. And by that law, I mean the Constitution. But government does not create the idea of rights or original rights. It acknowledges them, just as government does not create property or values and money. It acknowledges and regulates them. Wouldn't you say that's right, Nevis? Isn't that what they're supposed to do?
Yeah, I was looking through here for a quote from Chief Justice William O. Douglas, not Chief Justice, he was the Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a very famous man. And he says, quoting John Locke made articulate a long-standing view that legislative power needs to be curbed. Their power in the utmost bounds of it is limited to the public good of the society. It is a power that hath no other end but preservation, and therefore can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly impoverish the subjects. That was in a treatise of government in 1690. He said also, quoting Chief Justice Douglas, our Bill of Rights curbs all 3 branches of government. It subjects all departments of government to a rule of law and sets boundaries beyond which no official may go. It emphasizes that in this country man walks with dignity and without fear, that he need not grovel before an all-powerful government.
That reminds me of Douglas. He also said, and those who walk submissively will say there's no cause for alarm.
Yeah, he said some real cogent things about government. He definitely had the view that the man's dignity was far more important than the governmental operations.
My point in saying that was that there's a lot of people, maybe even here watching me today, who wonders, where am I coming from? Well, we're coming from that type of an attitude that Douglas just pointed out. Those who already walk submissively will say there is no cause for alarm. Those people that are running around out there who are good slaves don't see a problem. It's the person that's been damaged out there by its government who's now saying, I'm not going to walk submissively anymore. I want to know what my rights are. I want to know what property is. I want to know what I can do to have what I had 200 years ago, or should have had. And we don't have it anymore. And we're telling you that you have to go back to the basics and to learn what they should have taught you in the government schools. Government schools. I'm sorry, I shouldn't talk about schools because that's another long subject. Because the government schools teach the subjects exactly what the government wants them to know. And the government doesn't want you to know you've got any property rights, or anything else for that matter. Okay, a man then has an absolute right of recovery, for example. He can go into a farmyard, or let's assume that somebody's dumped his property out in the middle of a cornfield. How it got there, I don't know. But it's there. Now, it's my property, and it's in the middle of that cornfield. I have the right to go into that cornfield and to get my property and bring it out. I have that right, and the man that owned that land cannot stop me from doing that. But I don't have the right to go into that cornfield and do squirrelies and figure eights and go around here and destroy his crop all over the place and then get it and then do squirrelies and figure eights and come back out. I don't have that. That's damaging his property. I've exceeded my power or my right of recovery in that case. I've got to go straight to it and get it and come back out by the least amount of damage that I would cause. But that is a right of recovery that we do have. So now we have problems like, how about the sheriff routine taking our cars, Neelis?
Well, that's the same thing again. You have to ask, what right has the government got to do what it does? When it finds a man out here driving without a driver's license and without a registration, some officers seem to think that they need to seize the vehicle and just haul it away. And yet, what right does that officer or does his government have to your property? If you're the man standing there with the vehicle and you have open and notorious ownership and possession of it, it doesn't need to be papered. It doesn't need to have paper proof that you own it. It is owned by you notoriously and openly. You've got a pocket knife in your pocket. Who knows that you own that? You simply must assert your claim to it and let someone prove his claim if he's got an adverse claim. Government has no adverse claim to property. They have only a certain amount of rights and powers that they've been granted. When a man drives down the road in a vehicle and he owns it and he possesses it, then he should remain in possession of that vehicle. It should not be seized. It reminds me of the Admiralty law. If contraband goods are hauled on a vessel in the ocean, the government catches the captain of the ship hauling this contraband, they can seize his ship. They may sell it or they may hold it until such time as he's brought to justice and fined. This seems to be the same kind of procedure we're having here in our own streets. And yet, where does Admiralty law come in land? It shouldn't be here. We should have only a constitutional police force to help the orderly flow of traffic. And basically, a man's right to drive, and what he drives is his total sovereign right, as long as he isn't injuring those equal rights of others.
Yeah, we're going to get to that driving issue in just a minute here. Let's talk just briefly about our political rights first, and then we'll get to those rights on liberty. Political rights consist in the power to participate directly or indirectly in the establishment or management of government. These political rights are fixed by the Constitution. You see, all these definitions come back to the Constitution. They understood what those words meant many years ago. Every citizen has the right of voting for public officers and of being elected. These are political rights which the humblest citizen possesses. Now, we've got a new theory on this voting scam, and we're not too sure how this works, but Nelis, I want you to tell us about this new voting scam.
Well, you're speaking of the right to participate in civil government, I guess. Is that it?
Yeah, well, we were talking the other day, is where does our state government get this authority to pass these contracts? Where's the contract?
It would seem that the view espoused by our administrative personnel, at least what they've always put forth to us in just our conversation, is that our legislators are our agents. And our legislators can do the things that we would do if we had our own will, if we could exercise the legislative power. They become then our voice in government. And the view that they espouse is that our agents can bind us to certain civil obligations, such as to pay a tax or to support a road or to get a license. They always call it a licensing scheme, and it was passed through this legislature in 1935 and revised a little bit in 1953. And basically, that is how we have it today, that every person who drives on the road must have the license, must pay the registration, and now recently must get the liability insurance, and carry proof of that in his car. Okay, so how does this come down then? If your legislature acts as your agent, then what the agent does, the principal is bound by, because the principal authorized that agent to act in all respects. Now, if the agent signs a contract, the principal is bound by the terms and obligations of that contract. If the agent bound the principal to something the principal didn't allow him to do, then the principal bears the burden of proof to show that he didn't authorize him to do that. So you can see that if your legislature signs and enacts a law that binds you to get the license and pay the tax to drive on the roads, or to, for example, follow the codes when you build your house or put in your sewer electrical system, then if you renege on that contract, so to speak, if you don't do those things, then you have violated your own contract. You violated the word and the signature of your own agent. And therein we have another phenomenon. The traffic courts and most of the criminal law, I think, in this country is dished out today, is dished out under the handle of penal laws, penal codes. A penal clause in Bouvier's dictionary is a clause inserted in a contract whereby the person who violates any term of the contract can suffer a loss, a forfeiture of part of his bond that he put up to perform the contract. He forfeits a certain sum of money normally. Well, our traffic courts are exactly that. We have it in the legislature that if you violate any parts of those chapters of the traffic code, you'll suffer a fine and a penalty in that traffic court. And they have a special court all set up to administer these penalties. So you can see how easily it would be for us to assume that this is a contract that our legislators have set up with us, and we are the principals, and then if we go out on the street and we fail to do those things, we suffer a penalty in the traffic court. You can see how that kind of thinking would lead to the idea that we have all implied our consent to be bound by these rules. And yet, where is the individual consent? And especially if a man didn't vote for his legislators. Where did he give that consent? Well, it all comes down to that fundamental principle. Are we a republic, which is a rule by law, and that is the law of the land, or are we a democracy, which is a rule by a majority?
Yeah, that's right. I think that pretty well covers that political rights issue. Let's get on to the civil rights a little bit. And civil rights are broken down into several areas also. You've got absolute civil rights and you have relative civil rights. So let's talk about absolute rights first of all, because we all understand those probably a little bit better and they're more definitive. For example, the right of personal security. That consists in a person's legal and uninterrupted enjoyment of life, his limbs, his body, and his health and his reputation. That's your right. And it's your right to protect that yourself. Do you think for a minute that the policeman in your town, your city, or your county, or your state can protect you? When do they always show up? It's when the body is down there on the ground. And what you really need is a coroner and a truck. When somebody's damaging your property and you look out in the backyard or in the back 40 or wherever it might be, and you see somebody out there and you call the county sheriff, by the time the county sheriff is there, that person is gone and he's damaged your crops or whatever it might be. It's too late. The burden is upon you, and you have that personal right of property, personal property in that regard. It's called security. And you're responsible for your own security. It's not your state and your county and your city that's responsible to secure you. You're responsible to secure your own things, to include the safety of your family and your own property. And if you let the government do it, though, they'll do it for you. And that's what they're doing right there on the street right now. Those policemen are out there trying to take over your right to security of yourself and saying that you can't carry a gun. We'll carry the guns and we'll determine when to use them. And don't you carry one, and don't you try to protect your property. We'll do that for you. Okay, the second area of an absolute right is the personal liberty. And by definition, that exists in the power of locomotion, of changing situation, or removing one's person to whatever place one's inclination may direct, without restraint, unless by due course of law. Due course of law being the law of the land, not the statutes of the various states. Now, Neelis, you want to give us some information on that changing situation and moving one's person's property from one place to another, and what we were talking about, Article 4, Section 1, I think it was?
Well, if a man can't move himself across the country or even across the neighborhood to conduct business or to consult with others for his benefit or just the free passage of information, then he's definitely a slave. This is exactly the state in the communist countries. And a man can't travel in the communist countries unless he has his paperwork in order, which is about what we've got on the streets today.
Maybe I should tell them what happened to me in Spokane.
Why not?
Well, last week, or I guess it was, or about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, I was traveling in northern Idaho, up there visiting my sister-in-law and her husband, and also a son. And we were coming back into Washington from northern Idaho. And as I crossed the border, I didn't even really know I was crossing the border at the time, but this agent of the state decided that he wanted to talk to me a little bit, and counsel me or something like that. I'm not too sure what he wanted because he never did get around to telling me. But nevertheless, he stopped me alongside the roadside, and you know what? The first thing he wanted was, he wanted my papers. He wanted a driver's license. Well, I had a small problem. I don't have one of those, and I told him that. Then he became even more upset because on my side down here, I was wearing a .45 long Colt pistol. You know, not concealed or anything, just a normal everyday gun that you'd hang on your hip. And he really got excited about that. He didn't like that at all. We got into a real discussion about the carrying of weapons. And it seems as though in Washington they've got a statute up there, which of course I didn't know about, that you can't carry a loaded weapon in a car. I mean, that's just like saying that you can own an automobile, but you can't have any gas for it. How can that automobile function without gas? Well, how can a gun function without bullets in it? Can you only move your automobile without gasoline? I mean, that's just absolutely stupid on the face of it, but that's what he's telling me, and believe it or not, when I got into the statutes, that's exactly the way it was. But the dialogue broke down out there pretty rapidly, and my wife had to get out of the car and get in some dialogue with them, and my gosh, they wouldn't let her move the car until they checked her papers and saw that her papers were in order. And when her papers were in order, they decided to allow her to pass, that she could now worthy of coming into the state of Washington and moving through it. Where is my right to move between states or even interstate? It got lost, didn't it?
In Crandall versus State of Nevada, they ruled in 1867, this is the U.S. Supreme Court, that the citizen has the right to pass freely through the states. Now, one cannot be passing freely through the states if he has to buy a license and registration and carry all this paperwork with him. The court was very succinct in that, and they said, pursuant to Marbury versus Madison, the right to tax involves the power to destroy. So if the government is going to tax a man even $1 for his right to travel on the roads, then they can tax him $1,000 and stop him completely. And just basically, that is a privilege of citizenship of the United States, and so decided in Crandall and also in Twining versus New Jersey in 1908, that a man must be able to travel through the states because he may contract with his government at a seaport, he may contract with his government in another state, he may want to petition his government in, for example, from here to Portland, Oregon, and also to San Francisco. We have different governmental agencies that we might want to visit. And just basically any reason that a man wants to travel, and his reason is his own. He has the right to travel through those states freely. And that is a matter of the Constitution in Article 4, Section 2.
Yeah, and it doesn't work that way, obviously. And a little later on, we were up at the jail, and I was inside, and my wife and her sister and husband were outside, and my gosh, they couldn't even sit out there in peace and quiet until I got out. The county mounties had to come in over to them and demand all of their identification to make sure that their papers were in order. Now, I guess their papers were in order because they didn't end up in jail with me, but there they are checking people right outside the jail to see whether or not they're worthy to be out there in the streets or to even be out there in the county courthouse. I don't know what would have happened to those poor people had they not had a driver's license at that time. They would have probably joined me in jail. So you've got to look at this from a different perspective. I'm beginning to think that driver's license is the key to being passported throughout the United States. Now, we have a passport when we go outside the United States, and I think that's a very necessary thing so that we can keep track of our own citizens and traveling internationally. But within the United States, we're going to have passports now, and that's called a driver's license. So you have no free access of movement in this country without that driver's license, and that is your badge of identification. And without it, you're just not going to move. And just recently, I saw on TV the other night where they were checking a bunch of hobos in railroad cars and things like this, and what were they looking for? Identification. And what identification do they want? They want something with a picture on it, and it's called a driver's license. So even a bum can't ride a railroad car without identification. Where in the world are we coming to?